The revenge of the electric car. There are so many television commercials for cars and trucks that it's easy to become immune to them and ignore what's taking place in the ads. That's okay, because there's not really much of note happening. Carmakers looking to put a modicum of effort into their ads have been hawking the exact same things for decades. A car with a bit more room, a few extra miles per gallon, better handling, or an extra cup holder. Those that can't find anything interesting at all to tout about their cars turn to scantily clad women, men with British accents, and, when necessary, dancing mice in tuxedos to try and convince people that their products are better than the rest. Next time a car ad appears on your television, pause for a moment and really listen to what's being said. When you realize that the Volkswagen Sign and Drive event is code for "we are making the experience of buying a car slightly less miserable than usual," you'll start to appreciate just how low the automotive industry has sunk. In the middle of 2012, Tesla Motors stunned its complacent peers in the automotive industry. It began shipping the Model S sedan. This all-electric luxury vehicle could go more than 300 miles on a single charge. It could reach 60 miles per hour in 4.2 seconds. It could seat 7 people, if you used a couple of optional rear-facing seats in the back for kids. It also had 2 trunks. There was the standard one and then what Tesla calls a frunk, up front, where the bulky engine would usually be. The Model S ran on an electric battery pack that makes up the base of the car and a watermelon-sized electric motor located between the rear tires. Getting rid of the engine and its din of clanging machinery also meant that the Model S ran silently. The Model S outclassed most other luxury sedans in terms of raw speed, mileage, handling, and storage space. And there was more, like a cutesy thing with the door handles, which were flush with the car's body. Until the driver got close to the Model S. Then the silver handles would pop out, the driver would open the door and get in, and the handles would retract flush with the car's body again. Once inside, the driver encountered a 17-inch touchscreen that controlled the vast majority of the car's functions, be it raising the volume on the stereo or opening the sunroof with a slide of the finger. Whereas most cars have a large dashboard to accommodate various displays and buttons and to protect people from the noise of the engine, the Model S offered up vast amounts of space. The Model S had an ever-present internet connection, allowing the driver to stream music through the touch console and to display massive Google Maps for navigation. The driver didn't need to turn a key or even push an ignition button to start the car. His weight in the seat coupled with a sensor in the key fob, which is shaped like a tiny Model S, was enough to activate the vehicle. Made of lightweight aluminum, the car achieved the highest safety rating in history, and it could be recharged for free at Tesla stations lining highways across the United States and later around the world. For both engineers and green-minded people, the Model S presented a model of efficiency. Traditional cars and hybrids have anywhere from hundreds to thousands of moving parts. The engine must perform constant, controlled explosions with pistons, crankshafts, oil filters, alternators, fans, distributors, valves, coils, and cylinders among the many pieces of machinery needed for the work. The oomph produced by the engine must then be passed through clutches, gears, and drive shafts to make the wheels turn, and then exhaust systems have to deal with the waste. Cars end up being about 10 to 20% efficient at turning the input of gasoline into the output of propulsion. Most of the energy, about 70%, is lost as heat in the engine, while the rest is lost through wind resistance, braking, and other mechanical functions. The Model S, by contrast, has about a dozen moving parts, with the battery pack sending energy instantly to a watermelon-sized motor that turns the wheels. The Model S ends up being about 60% efficient, losing most of the rest of its energy to heat. The sedan gets the equivalent of about 100 miles per gallon. Asterisk. Yet another distinguishing characteristic of the Model S was the experience of buying and owning the car. You didn't go to a dealership and haggle with a pushy salesman. Tesla sold the Model S directly through its own stores and website. Typically, the stores were placed in high-end malls or affluent suburbs, not far from the Apple stores on which they were modeled. Customers would walk in and find a complete Model S in the middle of the shop and often an exposed version of the car's base near the back of the store to show off the battery pack and motor. There were massive touch screens where people could calculate how much they might save on fuel costs by moving to an all-electric car, and where they could configure the look and add-ons for their future Model S. Once the configuration process was done, the customer could give the screen a big, forceful swipe and his Model S would theatrically appear on an even bigger screen in the center of the store. If you wanted to sit in the display model, a salesman would pull back a red velvet rope near the driver's side door and let you enter the car. The salespeople were not compensated on commission and didn't have to try to talk you into buying a suite of extras. Whether you ultimately bought the car in the store or online, it was delivered in a concierge fashion. Tesla would bring it to your home, office, or anywhere else you wanted it. The company also offered customers the option of picking their cars up from the factory in Silicon Valley and treating their friends and family to a complimentary tour of the facility. In the months that followed the delivery, there were no oil changes or tune-ups to be dealt with because the Model S didn't need them. It had done away with so much of the mechanical dreck standard in an internal combustion vehicle. However, if something did go wrong with the car, Tesla would come pick it up and give the customer a loaner while it repaired the Model S. The Model S also offered a way to fix issues in a manner that people had never before encountered. With a mass-produced car, some of the early owners complained about glitches like the door handles not popping out quite right or their windshield wipers operating at funky speeds. These were inexcusable flaws for such a costly vehicle, but Tesla typically moved with clever efficiency to address them. While the owner slept, Tesla's engineers tapped into the car via the internet connection and downloaded software updates. When the customer took the car out for a spin in the morning and found it working right, he was left feeling as if magical elves had done the work. Tesla soon began showing off its software skills for jobs other than making up for mistakes. It put out a smartphone app that let people turn on their air conditioning or heating from afar and to see where the car was parked on a map. Tesla also began installing software updates that imbued the Model S with new features. Overnight, the Model S sometimes got new traction controls for hilly and highway driving or could suddenly recharge much faster than before or possess a new range of voice controls. Tesla had transformed the car into a gadget, a device that actually got better after you bought it. As Craig Venter, one of the earliest Model S owners and the famed scientist who first decoded man's DNA, put it, it changes everything about transportation. It's a computer on wheels. The first people to notice what Tesla had accomplished were the technophiles in Silicon Valley. The region is filled with early adopters willing to buy the latest gizmos and suffer through their bugs. Normally this habit applies to computing devices ranging from $100 to $2,000 in price. This time around, the early adopters proved willing not only to spend $100,000 on a product that might not work but also to trust their well-being to a startup. Tesla needed this early boost of confidence and got it on a scale few expected. In the first couple of months after the Model S went on sale, you might see 1 or 2 per day on the streets of San Francisco and the surrounding cities. Then you started to see 5 to 10 per day. Soon enough, the Model S seemed to feel like the most common car in Palo Alto and Mountain View, the two cities at the heart of Silicon Valley. The Model S emerged as the ultimate status symbol for wealthy technophiles, allowing them to show off, get a new gadget, and claim to be helping the environment at the same time. From Silicon Valley, the Model S phenomenon spread to Los Angeles, then all along the West Coast and then to Washington, D.C., and New York, although to a lesser degree. At first the more traditional automakers viewed the Model S as a gimmick and its surging sales as part of a fad. These sentiments, however, soon gave way to something more akin to panic. In November 2012, just a few months after it started shipping, the Model S was named Motor Trend's Car of the Year in the first unanimous vote that anyone at the magazine could remember. The Model S beat out 11 other vehicles from companies such as Porsche, BMW, Lexus, and Subaru and was heralded as proof positive that America can still make great things. Motor Trend celebrated the Model S as the first non-internal combustion engine car ever to win its top award and wrote that the vehicle handled like a sports car, drove as smoothly as a Rolls-Royce, held as much as a Chevy Equinox, and was more efficient than a Toyota Prius. Several months later, Consumer Reports gave the Model S its highest car rating in history, 99 out of 100, while proclaiming that it was likely the best car ever built. It was at about this time that sales of the Model S started to soar alongside Tesla's share price, and the General Motors, among other automakers, pulled together a team to study the Model S, Tesla, and the methods of Elon Musk. It's worth pausing for a moment to meditate on what Tesla had accomplished. Musk had set out to make an electric car that did not suffer from any compromises. He did that. Then, using a form of entrepreneurial judo, he upended the decades of criticisms against electric cars. The Model S was not just the best electric car, it was best car, period, and the car people desired. America had not seen a successful car company since Chrysler emerged in 1925. Silicon Valley had done little of note in the automotive industry. Musk had never run a car factory before and was considered arrogant and amateurish by Detroit. Yet, 1 year after the Model S went on sale, Tesla had posted a profit, hit $562 million in quarterly revenue, raised its sales forecast, and become as valuable as Mazda Motor. Elon Musk had built the automotive equivalent of the iPhone, and car executives in Detroit, Japan, and Germany had only their crappy ads to watch as they pondered how such a thing had occurred. You can forgive the automotive industry veterans for being caught unawares. For years Tesla had looked like an utter disaster, incapable of doing much of anything right. It took until early 2009 for Tesla to really hit its stride with the Roadster and work out the manufacturing issues behind the sports car. Just as the company tried to build some momentum around the Roadster, Musk sent out an email to customers declaring a price hike. Where the car originally started around $92,000, it would now start at $109,000. In the email, Musk said that 400 customers who had already placed their orders for a Roadster but not yet received them would bear the brunt of the price change and need to cough up the extra cash. He tried to assuage Tesla's customer base by arguing that the company had no choice but to raise prices. The manufacturing costs for the Roadster had come in much higher than the company initially expected, and Tesla needed to prove that it could make the cars at a profit to bolster its chances of securing a large government loan that would be needed to build the Model S, which it vowed to deliver in 2011. I firmly believe that the plan strikes a reasonable compromise between being fair to early customers and ensuring the viability of Tesla, which is obviously in the best interests of all customers, Musk wrote in the email. Mass market electric cars have been my goal from the beginning of Tesla. I don't want, and I don't think the vast majority of Tesla customers want us to do anything to jeopardize that objective. While some Tesla customers grumbled, Musk had largely read his customer base right. They would support just about anything he suggested. Following the price increase, Tesla had a safety recall. It said that Lotus, the manufacturer of the Roadster's chassis, had failed to tighten a bolt properly on its assembly line. On the plus side, Tesla had only delivered about 345 Roadsters, which meant that it could fix the problem in a manageable fashion. On the downside, a safety recall was the last thing a car startup needs, even if it was, as Tesla claimed, more of a proactive measure than anything else. The next year, Tesla had another voluntary recall. It had received a report of a power cable grinding against the body of the Roadster to the point that it caused a short circuit and some smoke. That time, Tesla brought 439 Roadsters in for a fix. Tesla did its best to put a positive spin on these issues, saying that it would make house calls to fix the Roadsters or pick up the cars and take them back to the factory. Ever since, Musk has tried to turn any snafu with a Tesla into an excuse to show off the company's attention to service and dedication to pleasing the customer. More often than not, the strategy has worked. On top of the occasional issues with the Roadster, Tesla continued to suffer from public perception problems. In June 2009, Martin Eberhard sued Musk and went to town in the complaint detailing his ouster from the company. Eberhard accused Musk of libel, slander, and breach of contract. The charges painted Musk as a bully monument who had pushed the soulful inventor out of his own company. The lawsuit also accused Musk of trumping up his role in Tesla's founding. Musk responded in kind, issuing a blog post that detailed his take on Eberhard's foibles and taking umbrage at the suggestions that he was not a true founder of the company. A short while later, the two men settled and agreed to stop going at each other. As co-founder of the company, Elon's contributions to Tesla have been extraordinary. Eberhard said in a statement at the time, "It must have been excruciating for Eberhard to agree to put that in writing, and the very existence of that statement points to Musk's skills and tactics as a hard-line negotiator." The two men continue to despise each other today, although they must do so in private, as legally required. Eberhard, though, holds no long-standing grudge against Tesla. His shares in the company ended up becoming very valuable. He still drives his Roadster, and his wife got a Model S. For so much of its early existence, Tesla appeared in the news for the wrong reasons. There were people in the media and the automotive industry who viewed it as a gimmick. They seemed to delight in the soap opera-worthy spats between Musk and Eberhard and other disgruntled former employees. Far from being seen universally as a successful entrepreneur, Musk was viewed in some Silicon Valley circles as an abrasive blowhard who would get what he deserved when Tesla inevitably collapsed. The Roadster would make its way to the electric car graveyard. Detroit would prove that it had a better handle on this whole car innovation thing than Silicon Valley. The natural order of the world would remain intact. A funny thing happened, however. Tesla did just enough to survive. From 2008 to 2012, Tesla sold about 2,500 Roadsters. The car had accomplished what Musk had intended from the outset. It proved that electric cars could be fun to drive and that they could be objects of desire. With the Roadster, Tesla kept electric cars in the public's consciousness and did so under impossible circumstances, namely the collapse of the American automotive industry and the global financial markets. Whether Musk was a founder of Tesla in the purest sense of the word is irrelevant at this point. There would be no Tesla to talk about today were it not for Musk's money, marketing savvy, chicanery, engineering smarts, and indomitable spirit. Tesla was, in effect, willed into existence by Musk and reflects his personality as much as Intel, Microsoft, and Apple reflect the personalities of their founders. Mark Tarpenning, the other Tesla co-founder, said as much when he reflected on what Musk has meant to the company. Elon pushed Tesla so much farther than we ever imagined, he said. As difficult as birthing the Roadster had been, the adventure had whetted Musk's appetite for what he could accomplish in the automotive industry with a clean slate. Tesla's next car, code-named Whitester, would not be an adapted version of another company's vehicle. It would be made from scratch and structured to take full advantage of what the electric car technology offered. The battery pack in the Roadster, for example, had to be placed near the rear of the car because of constraints imposed by the Lotus Elise chassis. This was okay but not ideal due to the imposing weight of the batteries. With Whitester, which would become the Model S, Musk and Tesla's engineers knew from the start that they would place the 1,300-pound battery pack on the base of the car. This would give the vehicle a low center of gravity and excellent handling. It would also give the Model S what's known as a low polar moment of inertia, which relates to how a car resists turning. Ideally, you want heavy parts like the engine as close as possible to the car's center of gravity, which is why the engines of race cars tend to be near the middle of the vehicle. Traditional cars are a mess on this metric, with the bulky engine up front, passengers in the middle, and gasoline sloshing around the rear. In the case of the Model S, the bulk of the car's mass is very close to the center of gravity, and this has positive follow-on effects to handling, performance, and safety. The innards, though, were just one part of what would make the Model S shine. Musk wanted to make a statement with the car's look as well. It would be a sedan, yes, but it would be a sexy sedan. It would also be comfortable and luxurious and have none of the compromises that Tesla had been forced to abreast with the Roadster. To bring such a beautiful, functional car to life, Musk hired Henrik Fisker, a Danish automobile designer, renowned for his work at Aston Martin. Tesla first revealed its plans for the Model S to Fisker in 2007. It asked him to design a sleek, four-door sedan that would cost between $50,000 and $70,000. Tesla could still barely make roadsters and had no idea if its all-electric powertrain would hold up over time. Musk, though, refused to wait and find out. He wanted the Model S to ship in late 2009 or early 2010 and needed Fisker to work fast. By reputation, Fisker had a flair for the dramatic and had produced some of the most stunning car designs over the past decade, not just for Aston Martin but also for special versions of BMW and Mercedes-Benz vehicles. Fisker had a studio in Orange County, California, and Musk and other Tesla executives would meet there to go over his evolving takes on the Model S. Each visit was less inspiring than the last. Fisker baffled the Tesla teams with his stodgy designs. Some of the early styles were like a giant egg, said Ron Lloyd, the former vice president of the Whitestar project at Tesla. They were terrible. When Musk pushed back, Fisker blamed the physical constraints Tesla had put in place for the Model S as too restrictive. He said they would not let him make the car sexy, Lloyd said. Fisker tried a couple of different approaches and unveiled some foam models of the car for Musk and his crew to dissect. We kept on telling him they were not right, Lloyd said. Not long after these meetings, Fisker started his own company, Fisker Automotive, and unveiled the Fisker Karma Hybrid in 2008. This luxury sedan looked like a vehicle Batman might take out for a Sunday drive. With its elongated lines and sharp edges, the car was stunning and truly original. It rapidly became clear that he was trying to compete with us, Lloyd said. As Musk dug into the situation, he discovered that Fisker had been shopping his idea for a car company to investors around Silicon Valley for some time. Kleiner Perkins Caufield and Byers, one of the more famous venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, once had a chance to invest in Tesla and then ended up putting money into Fisker instead. All of this was too much for Musk, and he launched a lawsuit against Fisker in 2008, accusing him of stealing Tesla's ideas and using the $875,000 Tesla had paid for design work to help get his rival car company off the ground. Fisker ultimately prevailed in the dispute with an arbitrator ordering Tesla to reimburse Fisker's legal fees and deeming Tesla's allegations baseless. Tesla had thought about doing a hybrid like Fisker where a gas engine would be present to recharge the car's batteries after they had consumed an initial charge. The car would be able to travel 50 to 80 miles after being plugged into an outlet and then take advantage of ubiquitous gas stations as needed to top up the batteries, eliminating range anxiety. Tesla's engineers prototyped the hybrid vehicle and ran all sorts of cost and performance metrics. In the end, they found the hybrid to be too much of a compromise. It would be expensive, and the performance would not be as good as the all-electric car, said J.B. Strobel. And we would have needed to build a team to compete with the core competency of every car company in the world. We would have been betting against all the things we believe in, like the power, electronics and batteries improving. We decided to put all the effort into going where we think the endpoint is and to never look back. After coming to this conclusion, Strobel and others inside Tesla started to let go of their anger toward Fisker. They figured he would end up delivering a kludge of a car and get what was coming to him. A large car company might spend $1 billion and need thousands of people to design a new vehicle and bring it to market. Tesla had nothing close to these resources as it gave birth to the Model S. According to Lloyd, Tesla initially aimed to make about 10,000 Model S sedans per year and had budgeted around $130 million to achieve this goal, including engineering the car and acquiring the manufacturing machines needed to stamp out the body parts. One of the things Elon pushed hard with everyone was to do as much as possible in-house, Lloyd said. Tesla would make up for its lack of R&D money by hiring smart people who could outwork and outthink the third parties relied on by the rest of the automakers. The mantra was that one great engineer will replace 3 medium ones, Lloyd said. A small team of Tesla engineers began the process of trying to figure out the mechanical inner Workings of the Model S. Their first step in this journey took place at a Mercedes dealership where they test drove a CLS 4-door coupe and an A-class sedan. The cars had the same chassis, and the Tesla engineers took measurements of every inch of the vehicles, studying what they liked and didn't like. In the end, they preferred the styling on the CLS and settled on it as their baseline for thinking about the Model S. After purchasing a CLS, Tesla's engineers tore it apart. One team had reshaped the boxy, rectangular battery pack from the Roadster and made it flat. The engineers cut the flow out of the CLS and plopped in the pack. Next they put the electronics that tied the whole system together in the trunk. After that, they replaced the interior of the car to restore its fit and finish. Following 3 months of work, Tesla had in effect built an all-electric Mercedes CLS. Tesla used the car to woo investors and future partners like Daimler that would eventually turn to Tesla for electric powertrains in their vehicles. Now and again, the Tesla team took the car out for drives on public roads. It weighed more than the Roadster but was still fast, and had a range of about 120 miles per charge. To perform these joyrides come tests in relative secrecy. The engineers had to weld the tips of the exhaust pipes back onto the car to make it look like any other CLS. It was at this time, the summer of 2008, when an artsy car lover named Franz von Holthausen joined Tesla. His job would be to breathe new life into the car's early designs and, if possible, turn the Model S into an iconic product. Asterisk. Von Holthausen grew up in a small Connecticut town. His father worked on the design and marketing of consumer products, and Franz treated the family basement full of markers, different kinds of paper, and other materials as a playground for his imagination. As he grew older, von Holthausen drifted toward cars. He and a friend stripped down a dune buggy motor one winter and then built it back up, and von Holthausen always filled the margins of his school notebooks with drawings of cars and had pictures of cars on his bedroom walls. Applying to college, von Holthausen decided to follow his father's path and enrolled in the industrial design program at Syracuse University. Then, through a chance encounter with another designer during an internship, von Holthausen heard about the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. This guy had been teaching me about car design and the school in Los Angeles, and I got super intrigued, said von Holthausen. I went to Syracuse for 2 years and then decided to transfer out to California. The move to Los Angeles kicked off a long and storied design career in the automotive industry. Von Holthausen would go on to intern in Michigan with Ford and in Europe with Volkswagen, where he began to pick up on a mix of design sensibilities. After graduating in 1992, he started work for Volkswagen on just about the most exciting project imaginable, a top-secret new version of the Beetle. It really was a magical time, von Holthausen said. Only 50 people in the world knew we were doing this project. Von Holthausen had a chance to work on the exterior and interior of the vehicle, including the signature flower vase built into the dashboard. In 1997, Volkswagen launched the new Beetle, and von Holthausen saw firsthand how the look of the car captivated the public and changed the way people felt about Volkswagen, which had suffered from woeful sales in the United States. It started a rebirth of the VW brand and brought design back into their mix, he said. Von Holthausen spent 8 years with VW, climbing the ranks of its design team and falling in love with the car culture of Southern California. Los Angeles has long adored its cars, with the climate lending itself to all manner of vehicles from convertibles to surfboard-toting vans. Almost all of the major carmakers set up design studios in the city. The presence of the studios allowed von Holthausen to hop from VW to General Motors and Mazda, where he served as the company's director of design. GM taught von Holthausen just how nasty a big car company could become. None of the cars in GM's lineup really excited him, and it seemed near impossible to make a large impact on the company's culture. He was one member of a 1,000-person design team that divvied up the makes of cars haphazardly, without any consideration as to which person really wanted to work on which car. They took all the spirit out of me, said von Holthausen. I knew I didn't want to die there. Mazda, by contrast, needed and wanted help. It let Von Holthausen and his team in Los Angeles put their imprint on every car in the North American vehicle lineup and to produce a set of concept cars that reshaped how the company approached design. As Von Holthausen put it, we brought the zoom back into the look and feel of the car. Von Holthausen started a project to make Mazda's cars more green by reevaluating the types of materials used to fabricate the seats and the fuels going into the vehicles. He had, in fact, just made an ethanol-based concept car when, in early 2008, a friend told him that Tesla needed a chief designer. After playing phone tag for a month with Musk's assistant, Mary Beth Brown, to inquire about the position, Von Holthausen finally got in touch and met Musk for an interview at the SpaceX headquarters. Musk instantly saw Von Holthausen, with his bouffant, trendy clothes and laid-back attitude, as a free-spirited, creative complement and wooed him with vigor. They took a tour of the SpaceX factory in Hawthorne and Tesla's headquarters in Silicon Valley. Both facilities were chaotic and reeked of startup. Musk ramped up the charm and sold Von Holthausen on the idea that he had a chance to shape the future of the automobile and that it made sense to leave his cushy job at a big, proven automaker for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Elon and I went for a drive in the Roadster, and everyone was checking it out, Von Holthausen said. I knew I could stay at Mazda for 10 years and get very comfortable or take a huge leap of faith. At Tesla, there was no history, no baggage. There was just a vision of products that could change the world. Who wouldn't want to be involved with that? While Von Holthausen knew the risks of going to a startup, he could not have realized just how close Tesla was to bankruptcy when he joined the company in August 2008. Musk had coaxed Von Holthausen away from a secure job and into the jaws of death. But in many ways, this is what Von Holthausen sought. At this point in his career, Tesla did not feel as much like a car company as a bunch of guys tinkering on a big idea. To me, it was exciting, he said. It was like a garage experiment, and it made cars cool. Again, the suits were gone, and so were the veteran automotive hands dulled by years working in the industry. In their stead, Von Holthausen found energetic geeks who didn't realize that what they wanted to do was borderline impossible. Musk's presence added to the energy and gave Von Holthausen confidence that Tesla actually could outflank much larger competitors. Elon's mind was always way beyond the present moment, he said. You could see that he was a step or three ahead of everyone else and 100% committed to what we were doing. Von Holthausen had examined the drawings of the Model S left by Fisker and a clay model of the car, and had come away unimpressed. It was a blob, he said. It was clear to me that the people that had been working on this were novices. Musk realized the same thing and tried to articulate what he wanted. Even though the words were not precise, they were good enough to give Von Holthausen a feel for Musk's vision and the confidence that he could deliver on it. I said, we're going to start over. We're going to work together and make this awesome. To save money, the Tesla Design Center came to life inside the SpaceX factory. A handful of people on Von Holthausen's team took over one corner and put up a tent to add some separation and secrecy to what they were doing. In the tradition of many a Musk employee, Von Holthausen had to build his own office. He made a pilgrimage to IKEA to buy some desks and then went to an art store to get some paper and pens. As Von Holthausen began sketching the outside of the Model S, the Tesla engineers had started up a project to build another electric CLS. They ripped this one down to its very core, removing all of the body structure and then stretching the wheelbase by 4 inches to match up with some of the early Model S specifications. Things began moving fast for everyone involved in the Model S project. In the span of about 3 months, Von Holthausen had designed 95% of what people see today with the Model S. And the engineers had started building a prototype exterior around the skeleton. Throughout this process, Von Holthausen and Musk talked every day. Their desks were close, and they men had a natural rapport. Musk said he wanted an aesthetic that borrowed from Aston Martin in Porsche and some specific functions. He insisted, for example, that the car seats 7 people. It was like, holy shit, how do we pull this off in a sedan? Von Holthausen said, but I understood. He had 5. kids and wanted something that could be thought of as a family vehicle, and he knew other people would have this issue. Musk wanted to make another statement with a huge touchscreen. This was years before the iPad would be released. The touchscreens that people ran into now and again at airports or shopping kiosks were for the most part terrible. But to Musk, the iPhone and all of its touch functions made it obvious that this type of technology would soon become commonplace. He would make a giant iPhone and have it handle most of the car's functions. To find the right size for the screen, Musk and von Holthausen would sit in the skeleton car and hold up laptops of different sizes, placing them horizontally and vertically to see what looked best. They settled on a 17-inch screen in a vertical position. Drivers would tap on this screen for every task except for opening the glove box and turning on the emergency lights, jobs required by law to be performed with physical buttons. Since the battery pack at the base of the car would weigh so much, Musk, the designers, and the engineers were always looking for ways to reduce the Model S's weight in other spots. Musk opted to solve a big chunk of this problem by making the body of the Model S out of lightweight aluminum instead of steel. The non-battery pack portion of the car has to be lighter than comparable gasoline cars, and making it all aluminum became the obvious decision, Musk said. The fundamental problem was that if we didn't make it out of aluminum, the car wasn't going to be any good. Musk's word choice there, obvious decision, goes a long way toward explaining how he operates. Yes, the car needed to be light, and, yes, aluminum would be an option for making that happen. But at the time, car manufacturers in North America had almost no experience producing aluminum body panels. Aluminum tends to tear when worked by large presses. It also develops lines that look like stretch marks on skin and make it difficult to lay down smooth coats of paint. In Europe, you had some Jaguars and one Audi that were made of aluminum, but it was less than 5% of the market, Musk said. In North America, there was nothing. It's only recently that the Ford F-150 has arrived as mostly aluminum. Before that, we were the only one. Inside of Tesla, attempts were repeatedly made to talk Musk out of the aluminum body, but he would not budge, seeing it as the only rational choice. It would be up to the Tesla team to figure out how to make the aluminum manufacturing happen. We knew it could be done, Musk said. It was a question of how hard it would be and how long it would take us to sort it out. Just about all of the major design choices with the Model S came with similar challenges. When we first talked about the touchscreen, the guys came back and said, "There's nothing like that in the automotive supply chain," Musk said. I said, "I know. That's because it's never been put in a fucking car before." Musk figured that computer manufacturers had tons of experience making 17-inch laptop screens and expected them to knock out a screen for the Model S with relative ease. The laptops are pretty robust, Musk said. You can drop them and leave them out in the sun, and they still have to work. After contacting the laptop suppliers, Tesla's engineers came back and said that the temperature and vibration loads for the computers did not appear to be up to automotive standards. Tesla's supplier in Asia also kept pointing the Carmaker to its automotive division instead of its computing division. As Musk dug into the situation more, he discovered that the laptop screens simply had not been tested before under the tougher automotive conditions, which included large temperature fluctuations. When Tesla performed the tests, the electronics ended up working just fine. Tesla also started working hand in hand with the Asian manufacturers to perfect their then immature capacitive touch technology and to find ways to hide the wiring behind the screen that made the touch technology possible. I'm pretty sure that we ended up with the only 17-inch touch screen in the world, Musk said. None of the computer makers or Apple had made it work yet. The Tesla engineers were radical by automotive industry standards, but even they had problems fully committing to Musk's vision. They wanted to put in a bloody switch or a button for the lights, Musk said. Why would we need a switch? When it's dark, turn the lights on. Next, the engineers put up resistance to the door handles. Musk and von Holthausen had been studying a bunch of preliminary designs in which the handles had yet to be drawn in and started to fall in love with how clean the car looked. They decided that the handles should only present themselves when a passenger needed to get in. the car. Right away, the engineers realized this would be a technological pain, and they completely ignored the idea in one prototype version of the car, much to the dismay of Musk and von Holthausen. This prototype had the handles pivot instead of popping out, von Holthausen said. I was upset about it. And Elon said, why the fuck is this different? We're not doing this. To crank up the pace of the Model S design, there were engineers working all day and then others who would show up at 9 p.m. and work through the night. Both groups huddled inside of the 3,000 square foot tent placed on the SpaceX factory floor. Their workspace looked like a reception area at an outdoor wedding. The SpaceX guys were amazingly respectful and didn't peek or ask questions, said Ali Javidin, one of the main engineers. As von Holthausen delivered his specifications, the engineers built the prototype body of the car. Every Friday afternoon, they brought what they had made into a courtyard behind the factory where Musk would look it over and provide feedback. To run tests on the body, the car would be loaded up with ballast to represent 5 people and then do loops around the factory until it overheated or broke down. The more von Holthausen learned about Tesla's financial struggles, the more he wanted the public to see the Model S. Things were so precarious, and I didn't want to miss our opportunity to get this thing finished and show it to the world, he said. That moment came in March 2009, when, just 6 months after von Holthausen had arrived, Tesla unveiled the Model S at a press event held at SpaceX. Amid rocket engines and hunks of aluminum, Tesla showcased a grey Model S sedan. From a distance, the display model looked glamorous and refined. The media reports from the day described the car as the love child of an Aston Martin and a Maserati. In reality, the sedan barely held together. It still had the base structure of a Mercedes CLS, although no one in the press knew that, and some of the body panels in the hood were stuck to the frame with magnets. They could just slide the hood right off, said Bruce Lee, a Tesla owner invited to attend the event. It wasn't really attached. They would put it back on and try and align it to get the fit and finish right, but then someone would push on it, and it would move again. It was one of those Wizard of Oz, man behind the curtain moments. A couple of the Tesla engineers practiced test driving the car for a couple of days leading up to the event to make sure that they knew just how long the car would go before it overheated. While not perfect, the display accomplished exactly what Musk had intended. It reminded people that Tesla had a credible plan to make electric cars more mainstream and that its cars were far more ambitious than what big-time automakers like GM and Nissan seemed to have in mind, both from a design and a range perspective. The messy reality behind the display was that the odds of Tesla advancing the Model S from a prop to a sellable car were infinitesimal. The company had the technical know-how and the will for the job. It just didn't have much money or a factory that could crank out cars by the thousands. Building an entire car would require blanking machines that take sheets of aluminum and chop them up into the appropriate size for doors, hoods, and body panels. Next up would be the massive stamping machines and metal dies used to take the aluminum and bend it into precise shapes. Then there would be dozens of robots that would aid in assembling the cars, computer-controlled milling machines for precise metalwork, painting equipment, and a bevy of other machines for running tests. It was an investment that would run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Musk would also need to hire thousands of workers. As with SpaceX, Musk preferred to build as much of Tesla's vehicles in-house as possible, but the high costs were limiting just how much Tesla could take on. The original plan was that we would do final assembly, said Diarmuid O'Connell, the vice president of business development at Tesla. Partners would stamp out the body parts, do the welding and handle the painting, and ship everything to Tesla, where workers would turn the parts into a whole car. Tesla proposed to build a factory to handle this type of work, first in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then later in San Jose, California, and then pulled back on these proposals, much to the dismay of city officials in both locales. The public hemming and hawing around picking the factory site did little to inspire confidence in Tesla's ability to knock out a second car, and generated the same type of negative headlines that had surrounded the Roadster's protracted delivery. O'Connell had joined Tesla in 2006 to help solve some of the factory and financing issues. He grew up near Boston in a middle-class Irish family and went on to earn a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College. After that, O'Connell attended the University of Virginia to get a master's degree in foreign policy and then Northwestern, where he got an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management. He had fancied himself a scholar of the Soviet Union and its foreign and economic policy and had studied these areas at OVA. But then, in 1988 and 1989, they're starting to close down the Soviet Union, and, at the very least, I had a brand problem, O'Connell said. It started looking to me like I was heading to a career in academia or intelligence. It was then that O'Connell's career took a detour into the business world, where he became a management consultant working for McCann Erickson Worldwide, Young & Rubicam, and Accenture, advising companies like Coca-Cola and AT&T. O'Connell's career path changed more drastically in 2001 when the planes hit the Twin Towers in New York. In the wake of the terrorist attacks, O'Connell, like many people, decided to serve the United States in any capacity that he could. In his late 30s, he had missed the window to be a soldier and instead focused his attention on trying to get into national security work. O'Connell went from office to office in Washington, D.C., looking for a job and had little luck until Lincoln Bloomfield, the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, heard him out. Bloomfield needed someone who could help prioritize missions in the Middle East and make sure the right people were working on the right things, and he figured that O'Connell's management consulting experience made him a nice fit for the job. O'Connell became Bloomfield's chief of staff and dealt with a wide range of charged situations, from trade negotiations to setting up an embassy in Baghdad. After gaining security clearance, O'Connell also had access to a daily report that collected information from intelligence and military personnel on the status of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Every morning at 6 a.m., the first thing to hit my desk was this overnight report that included information on who got killed and what killed them, O'Connell said. I kept thinking, this is insane. Why are we in this place? It was not just Iraq but the whole picture. Why were we so invested in that part of the world? The unsurprising answer that O'Connell came up with was oil. The more O'Connell dug into the United States' dependence on foreign oil, the more frustrated and despondent he became. My clients were basically the combat commanders, people in charge of Latin America and Central Command, he said. As I talked with them and studied and researched, I realized that even in peacetime, so many of our assets were employed to support the economic pipeline around oil. O'Connell decided that the rational thing to do for his country and for his newborn son was to alter this equation. He looked at the wind industry and the solar industry and the traditional automakers but came away unconvinced that what they were doing could have a radical enough impact on the status quo. Then, while reading Businessweek, he stumbled on an article about a startup called Tesla Motors and went to the company's website, which described Tesla as a place where we are doing things, not talking about things. I sent an email telling them I had come from the national security area and was really passionate about reducing our dependence on oil and figured it was just a dead letter type of thing. O'Connell said. I got an email back the next day.